Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Todd. Thank you very much for joining me today. I thought I would do something a little bit different today and tell my story of recovery from addiction and trauma and talk a little bit about some of the struggles that I had because, man, there were a lot. When I first got sober, I was in really, really tough shape, both from an addiction standpoint as well as from a trauma standpoint. So let's get started. Addiction for me hit me very early and very hard. Up until about the age 14, I was one of these guys who was just like, drugs are so dumb. Why would anybody want to do those? Why not just stay in touch with reality and blah, 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 and all of that kind of stuff. And then when I was about 14 years old, there were some woods that were right across the street from our house in this little suburban environment in Upper Arlington, Ohio. And one day I was walking through these woods and I came across this, it was just this dilapidated 12-pack of Miller beer. And was half covered in grass and it had been sitting there half in the sun for so long that the top of one of the cans was almost completely bleached white from the sunlight. So it had been there a while. And the weather was warm, so that beer was probably not very good. But I didn't know that at the time, right? And so as a little 14-year-old young man, I looked at that and I picked up a can and I popped it open and I drank it. And it was the nastiest stuff you could possibly imagine. I mean, it tasted kind of like a combination of skunk musk and fox pee. I mean, it was nasty, nasty. And so I drank 2.5 cans or 3 cans. And I remember as I was about the middle of the second can of slamming this stuff, it was like someone had grabbed my ankles and just shook my body. And it's like everything just seemed to snap in place. And in that moment, I didn't realize that I had been going through life just always feeling out of sorts, just feeling like nothing quite seemed to fit. You know, like the parts of my body just were not gelling together right. And I always felt this sense of just emotional edge and agitation and just, I always felt like there was something else that everybody else was a part of and that I didn't quite belong to and just felt this generalized sense of anxiety and just angst and irritability. And it was like something washed over me and just cleaned all that out. And I remember standing there going, my God, this must be how everyone else feels. This must be what everybody else's experience in life is like. Because for the first time, I felt just like this sense of wholeness. I felt this sense of calm. I felt like I could just go up to anybody and chat and hang out and have fun and do all of these things. It was like there was this piece that had been missing in my brain that somehow just got plugged in, and it's like, whoo, everything now just seemed to gel. And I never wanted to leave that feeling again. And so from that point forward, my life started to orient around how could I get more alcohol and just and continue drinking so that I didn't have to go back to the way that I had been feeling. And of course, being 14, you don't have that many options for buying alcohol. There was this, back in the day, this was back in the early 1980s, back in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, they had some of these roadside pull-up liquor stores that were like a barn, and you just pull your car up and pay them cash, and they would sell you whatever you wanted. And so it was not unusual for a bunch of us to get into a car, find a friend who could drive, and drive into one of these places and pay them cash, and they would look to see if there were any cops around and then sell us whatever we wanted. And usually we didn't have much money, so it was like buying old dusty cases of old German or something like that, some off-brand that nobody wanted to buy, but they'll offload it onto these teens who just wanted alcohol, right? And then I remember the first time that I smoked pot, which is within a year of that first time that I drank. And again, it was just like I smoked and smoked and smoked. And I felt my proportions of my body all distorted. It felt like my neck was about 4 feet tall, and my head was huge on top of this long neck and this little teeny body. It was really bizarre. But I can remember walking around at night in that state, just feeling like this is where I want to live. I just don't want to go back to feeling like I had before. Because growing up in a home where there was a lot of emotional neglect and a lot of shaming, and there was some very early sexual abuse that had happened, not at the hands of my parents, but from a school that I was attending. And then there was some stuff too that that my father had done. He didn't beat me, he didn't hit me, but would oftentimes put me in very terrifying situations. For example, when I was I must have been 4, something like that, maybe 5. We lived in this apartment on the upstairs of this house that had 2 floors. There's a lower floor where the owner lived, and the upper floor where we lived. And the owner on the lower level had this very, very aggressive police dog. It was like a German police dog. And I was terrified of this thing because it growled at me, and it would try to attack me whenever I got close. And, there were times when, my dad would swing me by the arms in the yard while that German police dog was trying to bite me, and I would just be helpless as this thing is snarling and trying to attack me. And I mean, just it was things like that, right, that were just utterly terrifying. Or being, when I was 2 or 3, just being abandoned in an elevator in some old building that I didn't know. I mean, there were just a lot of things like that then, when I got into my teenage years, there was not only, all of the emotional neglect and shaming, and always made to feel bad about myself. And my mother was one of these people who got too stressed by being around children, so she took a job where she would leave just before we got home from school, and then she would come home from work right when it was about our bedtime. And so I pretty much never saw her. And my father was so self-consumed with his often his own world that never saw him either. It was typical that I would get home, and my younger sister, who was 8 years younger, would get home, and my dad would come in and put two plates of food down on the table, kind of like feeding a dog, and then he'd go into his office and close the door, and we wouldn't see him. And so, and any time that there, I reached out to ask him, it's like, can we go do something? Would you mind playing catch? Would you, blah, blah, blah. It was always I'm too busy for you. Or if I acted out or did something that, he deemed wrong, then it was this, I can remember him just saying, you're going to be severely punished, and, just really, what is wrong with you? And all of these kinds of things, just being very, very demeaning. And so, by the time I discovered alcohol and drugs, I was an emotional mess. I was engaged in some really bizarre behavior, even as a very, very young child, because I was just in such a state of emotional turmoil. And there was no one there who would even pay attention to me or, help me make sense of my world. The only thing that I would get is, Mom, can I have $4 to go to the movies with all of my friends? And it was, well, I wish I could go to the movies, and blah, all of these kinds of things. So it wasn't even like, it's any time that I reached out for any kind of just normal kid stuff, I was made to feel very bad and shamed for that. And really, no matter what decision I made, there was something wrong with it, or I was mocked. And that even, continued into my adulthood. I remember, convincing my grandmother when Apple computer stock was $4 a share to buy a bunch. And she did, and then I just got an unending amount of mocking from my father for doing that. And of course those shares today would be worth about $50 million. But the point is that there was just nothing that I could do or say or whatever that was ever received well, or I just wouldn't get any attention at all. And so once I got into adolescence and I found alcohol and drugs, that was the first time that I just felt like a reprieve from all of that. It's like, this is the first time that I felt like I could just be present with other people and hang out and laugh and have fun and just, be myself without the fear of somebody, criticizing me or attacking me or doing whatever or shaming me. I could just be myself. And of course, I was around a lot of other addicts at the time. And so we were all pretty, traumatized people who all had found alcohol and drugs to help us all feel better. And so, none of us really had the language or understanding to, really talk about how we felt wounded or what was going on. I think there was, there were people who would go through periods of depression. There was one of my high school buddies that, when he was 17, shot himself in the chest with a .45. Another who, a guy that I hung out with in high school, again, drug buddy, was killed playing chicken in a car. Had a head-on collision and killed himself. Another one was shot in the neck and paralyzed when he was beating his mom up to get more beer money. Shot in the neck by his father. There was just a lot of that sort of thing that surrounded me. One of the guys that I hung out with, and we did a lot, we'd do a lot of drugs. He would, get this huge knife and put it under his jacket and then just go wander at night. It's like, mean, I look back on that now and it's just like, wow, that is crazy. I mean, there were some really damaged people, and I was one of them. And, I was never a violent guy ever. I was, most of my hostility was turned inward. I just felt like, when I wasn't high, I just would feel extremely depressed. I would feel just like I'm a completely unlovable, broken human being. And finally, when I was 16, my parents divorced, and I had to make a decision on either to move in with my mom or my dad, and I chose to move in with my dad, who already had another girlfriend, and so when we moved into his place, at his new apartment, man, that's when my addiction just really accelerated. And by the time I was 16, certainly, I was a daily drug user. And that's all I wanted to do. And I was hanging around with the people who, who the police all knew, right? I mean, this was the criminal element. These were all the drug dealers. These were the people who were involved in a lot of crime, and these were the people who accepted me and who could always keep me supplied with drugs, and who I felt like I just fit in with. And in looking back, I fit in with all of these people, right? Because they were all broken human beings too. We were all very traumatized people who could not make sense of our pain, or didn't feel like we had any other option. And alcohol and drugs was the only thing that gave us a sense of reprieve from the pain that we felt on the inside. And there was one time during that period that I thought, you know what? I'm going to try to just quit using just quit using and see what that's like. And I lasted a week. And I remember going 1 week without using any drugs. And I went over to a buddy's apartment where there was a bunch of other people there who were all who were all doing drugs. And I remember feeling so proud of myself that I had gone a week. I was like, you know what? I'm going to celebrate by getting stoned. And so, so that's what I did. And, things escalated to the point where, I would do 7 hits of acid at a time. We had this big brass tray, and we may put a half pound a pot on there and clean it. And by the end of the weekend, that whole thing might be gone from, all of the people that were there. And, we'd break into people's apartments and have parties while they weren't there. And just all this, and it's insane, and I think about it today, all of that was just so insane and was such a departure from the way that I grew up, right? But alcohol and drugs, particularly when it's mixed with trauma, does some very interesting things to the brain. There's like this inability to differentiate between what is real and what is not real after a while. It's kind of like stealing a friend's stereo and selling it for drugs. For some reason, there's not this, that doesn't register as being a bad thing to do. It doesn't necessarily come off as like a good thing to do, but there's just this weird kind of erasure of kind of a moral compass that happens. It's like all of your boundaries just start to dissipate. Anything that you had believed or that you had held as a value starts to erode. And you just get into this place where, you are just in a reactive state where every day the only thing that matters is what's right in front of you. And what's right in front of you is where's the next drug going to come from? Where's the booze going to come from? Where is the acid going to come from? Where's the stuff going to come from to keep me in this state, to keep me feeling like I am okay? And it doesn't matter where that comes from. It doesn't matter how you get it. The only thing that matters is that you get it. And the mind is a very interesting thing, right? There are some people who will claim that human beings are rational, and I don't believe that that's true anymore. I think that human beings are more rationalizing, that we act out of a state of woundedness or we act out of emotion. And then we go back and rationalize that in some way. And, when you're sober and your brain isn't being kind of distorted by alcohol and drugs, oftentimes, the rationality can kind of make sense. Where you're like, I know I yelled a minute ago, I apologize. Rationalization comes in. I've had a tough day. I was just a little bit agitated, and I didn't mean for that to come out on you. And that kind of thing makes some sense, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But when your emotions start becoming very dysregulated, right? And alcohol and drugs start distorting your perceptions, and you no longer have a sense of what's real and what's not real anymore. And then you add all of this, distorted perceptions from emotional woundedness and all of these, kind of emotional reactions and emotional instability. And then you've got your brain running around trying to rationalize all of the crazy things that you do. It's like some of the justifications that you come up with are just bizarre, if you can even justify things at all. I mean, there are times when, somebody asked me, why did you just steal one of your friend's stereos and sell it for drugs? It's like, in the moment when I'm doing that, there would be kind of this, oh, well, I'll pay them back kind of rationalization or something. But then later, of course, that never happens. And then later, there's almost like this, regret and like, I don't know why I did that. Honestly, I might come up with some kind of excuse of, oh, well, they never use it, or, well, they owed me for something, or I, come up with some excuse, right? Come up with some kind of rationalization. But the reality is that a lot of addictive behavior is kind of nonsensical. I mean, it is not grounded in any kind of rational, structured, thoughtful way. It is, all boundaries, all morals, all ethics really just eventually disappear. There might be some remnants for a while, but eventually, the further down the road of addiction that you go, all of that stuff melts away, and the only thing that you're left with is just this hole in your soul that needs to be filled. And that was certainly the case for me. And when I, at 17, when I started my senior year of high school, and I was one of these kids in high school that the school was like, we just got to get him out of here. This kid is not going to do well. He's probably going to be dead by the time he's 20. We just have to get him out of here. with a diploma. So that we look good like we're graduating all our kids instead of having a bunch of dropouts. So they had this special program where you would go in for a half day in the mornings into this room where all of the other kind of flunkies and junkies would hang out, and there would be a teacher up there who would bring in donuts and try to teach just some basic life skills, like what is a checkbook, what is a bank account, just very fundamental things, just to try to get some kind of skills taught to us. But a lot of times we would just sit and hang out and talk about life and what's going on and all of that. And so we would be there until about 11:30 in the morning, and then we were free to go to work. And most of the time, none of us didn't work. We would just go out and hang out and deal drugs and do all of those kinds of things. And that's what I did. I mean, I would show up there. I'd have some donuts, hang out with some of my druggy friends in the morning, and then we would be free. And then I would go and just go to somebody's house and party, or go get some drugs, or do something like that. And then finally at 17, during my senior year of high school, I ran away from home and called some relatives that I had up in Minnesota, and they got me into a treatment center up here. And what was interesting about that whole scenario, I had an aunt that worked at Hazelden, which is a very prominent treatment facility in Minnesota that is world renowned. And so she worked there, and she was able to get me into a detox up in Minnesota, and then to meet with an intake counselor in the kind of the teen unit of Hazelden. And I remember talking with this counselor, and this counselor would ask me questions like, have you ever missed a day of school? I'm like, no. Of course I didn't, because that's where all my druggy friends were, and we got donuts, and I went and used with my friends. So no, I never missed any school. Have you ever had any blackouts? And I was like, no, not that I can remember, which is interesting because I had. There was a time, the first time that I tried Quaaludes, I'd been drinking heavy, and I took 2 Quaaludes that had been given to me by another guy at a party. And as I was going to drive home, a friend of mine was like, are you, and I don't remember any of this, I blacked out, but he told me later, he asked me if I was okay to drive, and I was like, yep. And I put my key in the ignition, I turned on the car, I went to put the car in reverse, and I passed out. And so he drove me home and hoisted me on his shoulder, broke into my dad's apartment, and plopped me down on my bed, and then walked home. And that act probably saved my life, because had I passed out, literally 1 minute later, I would have been driving right through downtown Columbus, Ohio, and would have likely either killed myself or killed somebody else. But I did have a blackout. But during this intake interview, I didn't remember anything about it. And so I went through all of these questions. And of course, the way that I answered them made it seem like I didn't have any trouble with alcohol or drugs at all. And at first, they weren't even going to accept me into the treatment program, because, the intake counselor went to my aunt and just said, it doesn't look like he has any alcohol or drug problems at all. And of course, it was so far from the truth. But that's one of the things that is just true about addiction, right? is that it is one of the only diseases. It's only one of the only conditions that convinces us that it's not there, right? Even though we're faced with all of the evidence, it will try to convince it. It's that rationalizing part of the brain, right? It'll try to convince us that, in fact, we're not addicts at all. And it'll really minimize how we perceive our own drinking or using. It'll, kind of explain away different kinds of events. It'll minimize things. It'll make us just literally forget certain things that happened, such as the blackout or going to parties and really being obnoxious, or just a number of things that I would do. My brain would just block those out, right? Because it was more important for me to be able to sustain my drug use, right, than really recognize how unhealthy it was. And this is something that happens below our level of consciousness, right? And this is one of the things that can be really frustrating sometimes when trying to get help for an alcoholic or addict. And it's like you can throw all kinds of evidence at them, but until they are ready to change, it's like they're like Wonder Woman with those freaking bracelets, right? They can ricochet any or deflect any bullet that comes at them. And I was the same way, right? People would say, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And I could just go pew, 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 because my brain could not see reality very well. And I was really good at rationalizing things and minimizing things and dismissing things and just denying things that were true, but I had convinced myself that they weren't. And that's just part of the addictive brain. And so when I go in and I have had to do what are called 12-step calls, right, where I will go in and do a family intervention where I will be part of either as a consultant or as an outside person, or even as a family member when I've had to do interventions on people. I can see myself in them and in their struggle to try to not see themselves as addicts. It's just so important to not see yourself as an addict, because if you do, then it's like, oh, the game's over. The game's over. Once you really recognize that, oh my God, I'm an addict, then the game is over. And so I went through treatment, and I was there for 10 months. And I was a complete and utter wreck. Because not only did I have the addiction piece, right, but there was all of this trauma stuff that I was dealing with as well, that I had just kept sedated for a long time, and now all of that stuff was rushing back in. And at the end of that 10 months, I ended up going back out, and I ended up using again, and went back to Ohio, and was a daily user again, and was dealing and was right back to it. And I ultimately ended up, through a series of, really bad situations with, my dad and all of that. I ended up living in an abandoned house with, with some other addicts, and was pretty much just there using to die. My heroes at the time were like Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, and for the young people, you may not know who those are, but they all died of their addiction, right? Jimi Hendrix, brilliant guitar player, brilliant musician, but just flaming alcoholic and addict. And Jim Morrison, the same way, from the Doors, Janis Joplin, and all of them died of their addiction. And I was just like, that's going to be me. Right? I recognized that this was going to be the end for me, and I just didn't care. And that really speaks to the power of addiction, where it's like, even though you know that this is going to be the end of your life, it's just like the only thing that feels real is getting the next high, is just, where the next drug's going to come from. And so the only way, because I was unemployable, the only way that I could maintain any kind of supply of drugs was to actually was to buy larger quantities and sell smaller quantities. And that came with its own risks, because there are times when I would have to go into hiding after money was stolen and people were after me and all of that. I mean, I likely would not have survived very much longer had I not gotten sober when I did. But then on September 10th of 1983, I had what could only be described as some kind of massive spiritual awakening. And it was about 2:30 in the morning, and I was standing in the kitchen of this abandoned house. And, it was early autumn, and the trees had, started to change, and it was fairly cool and dry. And I was just standing in this kitchen, just looking out over the woods and the field that was behind the house. And all of a sudden, I felt myself just freeze in place. And I was suddenly surrounded by this yellow light, like this pale yellow light. And everything in the room just looked a lot different. It was like the dimensions had expanded in every dimension. And all of the color was kind of drained out of everything. And then I heard this deep resonant voice just say, "You don't have to live like this anymore." And then it was all over. And I was like, the hell was that? And I haven't had a drop of alcohol or drugs since. And I don't know what happened that night. And I know that when I tell that story, it's interesting. About half the people just roll their eyes and is like, yeah, whatever. And it's like, I would probably do the same thing had it not happened to me, right? Because it sounds kind of like a made for Hollywood movie kind of thing, but it was a real thing. And some have asked me whether it was like an acid flashback or something like that, and I'm like, yeah, it wasn't. First of all, I wasn't particularly loaded at the time. I had had acid flashbacks before, but usually, when I have acid flashbacks, it's like I'm watching my girlfriend turn into Frankenstein, or I'm seeing the walls breathe, or there's one time I opened a door to go down a flight of stairs, and there were all these colored triangles bouncing all over the place. So those are, it was nothing like that. It was nothing like that at all. And some have asked, do you think this was you being touched by God? And again, it's like, I just don't know. I don't know. I don't lean toward being a super religious person, but there have been instances in my life where I have to kind of back off, the disbelief a bit and say, I just don't know, because what happened, I can't explain it. It was a real event, but I can't explain it. And I know that in that moment, something very fundamentally shifted in me. And I went from being a daily drug user, living in this abandoned house on a path to death, to suddenly having the entire trajectory of my life switched around in just those couple of moments. So it was something that happened. And I wish that this was one of the stories where It was like, God came down and touched me, and now all of a sudden everything was great, right? But it wasn't like that. The only thing that changed for me was that the compulsion to use alcohol and drugs was gone. And there was a moment of clarity that I have to go a different direction in life. And so I made a decision at that moment that I was willing to do whatever it took to become the best person that I possibly could. I didn't care if it killed me. Like, I literally don't care if I die in the process. I am willing, just tell me what to do. Show me what to do. I will do it. I will go to any length, right, to heal and to become the best person that I possibly can. But here I am, starting in this place of just, not only has my brain, just been intoxicated with alcohol and drugs for years, but I also had a deep sense of woundedness that I didn't understand at all. And frankly, back in 1983, nobody really understood that stuff, right? I mean, it was PTSD had just been added to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that is of mental disorders, right? That psychologists and psychiatrists used as kind of the recognized mental illnesses, and that was only related to people who have experienced combat or police, or people that have experienced very significant, horrifying events. And so there weren't any books, and going to therapists really wasn't all that helpful either, because I'd get all these diagnoses of bipolar or depression or ADHD or all of these other things, and I would be given lithium, I would be given different stimulants for the ADHD. I'd be given antidepressants. I mean, at very beginning, I was on what were called tricyclic antidepressants, really before the SSRIs, like Prozac and Wellbutrin and all of those came out. And then, I was also on Prozac, and, they were trying all these drugs, and none of them really seemed to do much for me, except just make me feel like a zombie and numbed out and just kind of disoriented or whatever. And but I just kept trying, and I just kept searching, and I kept just thinking, and trying to figure out, why do I feel so bad? Why do I keep behaving in the ways that I'm doing? And just really searching and trying to understand all of that. And over a period of a couple of decades of, struggling through all of the effects of trauma and emotional flashbacks, and some of the flashbacks being very intense, where, there was a time when I remember very clearly I was working on my very first book that was called Why Do I Keep Doing That? That really was just kind of putting words to the struggle that I was having when I recognized that I was self-sabotaging, or I would start having a great relationship with somebody and then just like undermine it. And it's like, why am I doing this? Why do I keep trying to rescue people who only take advantage of me? Why do I keep doing all of these things that just put me in positions to be hurt? So I was in the middle of working on this book, not with any answers, but more really a question. That's why I called the book, Why Do I Keep Doing That? And I remember when I walked out of a Barnes & Noble one time where I had been sitting there working, and I opened the door, and all of a sudden this vivid image of somebody rushing up to me and just stabbing me repeatedly in the chest over and over, just all of a sudden just completely came over me, and I was just suddenly just filled with terror. And I know where that came from. That came from some, pretty icky abuse that I had had in a school that I attended when I was very, very young. But it was like these were the kinds of things that I dealt with all of the time, right? Or driving down the road and suddenly becoming just overwhelmingly terrified that someone was going to cross the road and run right into me on purpose, right, and kill me. And they just like these kinds of things were things that I just lived with every day. And I was like, oh man. And just, feeling this sense of just profound depression and unlovability and like running in one direction and trying to do something in an effort to find myself, and then rejecting all of that and doing something else, and kind of flailing all over the place, trying to figure out who I am and just trying to feel a sense of safety and groundedness and all of that. And, throughout this whole process, I started to come up with a whole theoretical model of kind of Todd's crazy brain, of like, where is this stuff coming from? It's like, there's something that is going on, inside that's below my level of awareness that's getting triggered. And I could recognize that pattern. And I started, I started questioning and, making this kind of this whole psychological construct of that would explain why all of this stuff was happening. And when I went to apply to the doctoral program in clinical psychology, I brought this whole theoretical model in to my interview and was explaining it. And I had charts and circles and arrows and all of this kind of stuff. And I kind of went over all of this to the kind of the admissions advisor who was interviewing me to get into the school. And I mean, I look back on it now and I just can't imagine what she must have thought at the time. But she said, well, that's interesting. We all have to come up with our own theory of how things work. But once I got into graduate school, and I started learning about a lot of these other models of psychology, some of them really seemed to fit, and some of them I'm like, they don't explain my experience. They don't explain trauma. They don't explain addiction. Like cognitive behavioral therapy and some things like that. It's like, I can understand how that tool works. But, when I tried it in therapy, it really didn't do much. But then there were a couple of things that I, came upon. The first one was all about attachment. And John Bowlby, back in the really like 60s, 70s, and 80s, was doing a lot of writing on emotional bonding and these attachment relationships between parents and children and how they were important to the emotional development of a child. And I was like, oh my God. I mean, that explained so much, because so much of what had happened to me was deprivation of those attachments. And not only was there a deprivation, but those attachment bonds actually became a source of injury for me, where the people who were supposed to be making me feel positive about myself and safe and valued and all of those kinds of things were actually delivering poison to me through that conduit, who were delivering messages of shame and how I'm wrong and how I can never do anything right and all of these kinds of things, and always making me question myself. And, whenever I would, come up with an idea and say something, there was always something wrong with it and all of that. So, when I started to understand attachment, and I was like, wow, that's where a lot of my woundedness came from. And then, then a lot of research later started coming out around the effects of trauma and how how trauma affects the brain. But most of it still was referring to the kind of trauma where you are trapped and overwhelmed and in a very dangerous situation, right? So there's a part of yourself that feels overwhelmed, like you're being attacked. You're in a sinking ship. I mean, something where you're feeling trapped and overwhelmed and in a very, very dangerous situation. But then it started to occur to me that, there's another form of trauma there that is related to this attachment piece. And there is not only this trauma that happens from, kind of the overwhelming of the nervous system, right? That'll cause some of the flashbacks and stuff that I'd been experiencing. But there's another form of trauma that happens when you have caregivers who are neglectful and are not connecting, not attaching in a healthy way. So either they're not attached at all, or they are actually actively undermining your sense of self. And that clarity is what allowed me to all of a sudden make sense of why I was so nuts. It's like I wasn't nuts in the sense that there was something wrong with my brain. In fact, my brain was normal, but it was being brought up in a situation that was highly toxic. And so it had to adapt and survive in an environment where there was not only a deprivation of what it needed to grow. So it's like the body wasn't getting the right nutrients, right? But it was also being attacked, and often by the very people who were supposed to be offering nurturance and support. And so that just completely opened up a whole new world of understanding. And so when I started working with clients, and I worked primarily with couples because that relational piece just was, I saw as being so critical, that attachment piece. And I recognize that adult relationships, right, are also based on those attachments. And so if a couple is struggling, it's because something that they are doing is interfering with their ability to remain emotionally bonded. And so as somebody who had lived through so much of that, I felt like my superpower was being able to recognize when there was disconnection or when there was toxicity happening in those attachment bonds, because I had lived it. And I could see when people were reacting or things that they would say. I'm like, I have felt those things. I have said those things. So I know exactly what you're experiencing. I know exactly what's going on. In fact, I had one couple one time where they had this fight around their 14-year-old son who had been suspended from school for doing something. I mean, it was dumb. And in further conversation with the parents, I mean, it's not like this kid was heading for trouble, right? It's just there was a typical 14-year-old boy with a couple of friends doing dumb stuff kind of thing. But the husband, underneath of his breath one time, when they brought their son home, the son went in the other room and the father said, "What an idiot." And the mom just absolutely became flooded and just reacted strongly. And even in the clinic, it's like as she was saying, "I can't believe you said that about him," I could see her skin change. And I was like, something happened that she has not communicated or that she may not be aware of. And I just paused for a moment, and I said, what happened? And she looked at me, kind of with this quizzical look, and then all of a sudden she started crying, and it's like, yeah, she'd been molested, and these things had happened, and so I'm like, yep, that needs to be addressed before we really do anything with the relational piece, because chances are pretty good that those traumatic events that had happened that are getting triggered are the driving force in the difficulties that they were having as a couple. And so as I have gone forward and worked with a lot of people in the clinic, it has really helped me as well recognize that, you know what, being traumatized and having addiction leaves you with a pretty interesting brain, right? And it's not that, even though there are times, particularly before I really had an understanding of how, how trauma and attachment, injury, and all of that impacts our nervous system and impacts our brain. I used to joke that I had spastic brain syndrome, or that I had a broken brain, because I felt like, my God, why am I so nuts? I can tell that my brain is not working the same way that other people's are. I could just tell. But I for a long time, I thought there must be something wrong with my brain. And having gone through a lot of healing now, and really having an understanding of the impact of trauma and addiction on our emotional system and on the brain, I now just realize that, no, you know what? Being crazy because you grew up in a home like that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with you, right? It doesn't mean that you have a broken brain. It doesn't mean that you're bad, sick, or wrong, or that there's something innately different about you. It is that you likely have a very normal brain. You're a very normal person who was forced to grow up in very toxic environments. And because of that, your emotions, your perceptions, right, your self-concept had to adapt to that environment in order to survive, right? And now that you're out of that environment and you're trying to interact with a world that isn't like that, now all of a sudden it's like, man, I feel like there's something wrong with me. It's like, why can everybody else seem to do things that I can't? And it's like, what's wrong with me? And it's like, there's nothing wrong with you. The only thing that needs to happen, and this is the lesson that I had to learn for myself, right, is that I had to relearn, reprogram, so to speak, heal from some of those attachment injuries, heal the parts of my self-concept that were not developed well when I was growing up, right? And actually start developing those in adulthood through relationships. And also just cutting myself some slack, right? For just, it's like, yeah, sometimes I still to this day can react in ways that I'm kind of like, why am I reacting like this? I mean, this is crazy. And it's like, yeah, but it doesn't mean anything, I mean, it's like those wounds from the past, while they may never completely go away, and this is what I found for myself, right? I mean, those wounds from the past don't ever completely go away, but they no longer direct my life, right? So sometimes I can recognize when things get triggered, and I can just go, oh, that's part of that old wounded self that is reacting right now. But that doesn't have to be the directing force in my life anymore. That doesn't have to organize my thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and the decisions that I make, and all of those kinds of things, or even how I understand myself. But that's been a long journey. It has been a long, long journey. going from that really, that abandoned house back in 1983 to where I am today has been an extraordinary journey of intense work. And what I have learned throughout that whole process and through the clinical work that I have done and all the stuff that I've written and all of that is what I bring to share to the world. And hopefully somebody can benefit from it. Maybe you hear something in here that is like, you know what, I get it. That's me. I understand that. And if that's the case, then I've done my job, because I am here just to help and to be helpful. So I want to thank you very much for joining me today. It was a little bit of a different episode and kind of meandered around a little bit, but I hope that you found that this helpful. And if you did, I would just appreciate it if you'd hit the subscribe button and then share this with anybody else who may benefit from hearing all of this. So appreciate your time. Talk to you soon.